Okay, so welcome to another episode of the RJ webinar series. It's a real treat and a real pleasure to have an interview with Ben Lyon. And I'll ask Ben to introduce himself in a minute, but just to say a little disclaimer here that Ben and I have worked for, well, don't want to say how many decades, but Ben has been my mentor, my supporter, my advisor for many, many, many years. He's one of the, if not the longest serving restorative justice practitioner, at least in the UK. But yeah, it's just a huge, huge privilege to have worked with Ben and to have him as part of our series. As you know, this series are hosted by the RJ for All International Institute. RJ for All stands for Restorative Justice for All. These webinars are free, like most of the stuff that we produce is free. We say what it says on the tin. And it's a real pleasure to be offering this webinar. So yeah, if you haven't signed up to our channel, please do. And then I'll just ask Ben to briefly introduce himself and tell us very briefly how he got into restorative justice. Ben.
Well, thank you, Theo. It's great to see you. Do you want to? I'm not going to waste time with a long CV. I came out of the police. It seemed a good idea at the time. Started looking at it. Went on a course or two. Ended up doing a couple of experimental programs. One for the government and the Home Office, as it was then, and then on into the probation service and working with your good self. Most of that time, actually, either as a source of research, whatever. But we've led a good parallel restorative life in the meantime. I think you'd agree. Do you want to? I'm not going to waste time with a long CV. I came out of the police. It seemed a good idea at the time. Started looking at it. Went on a course or two.
And yeah, just to put things in context chronologically, for those who don't know, when Ben is referring to the Home Office, I'm assuming you're referring to the pilots that then created the first evidence base with Sherman and Strang, I think, with the Connect and the Remedy projects. Is that right? Is that what you're talking about? Or
Yeah. I think we were one of the problems is that we were seen as the opposition. I think our little program was crumbs from the rich man's table, but we learned a lot from it ourselves, and we did some good for other people, which is what it's really about, isn't it? We're here, whatever we say, and we'll be critical. Whatever we say, we start from a base of being positive and trying to help victims, people who cause the problems, the harm, and our fellow practitioners to be successful, hopefully.
Yeah, and I think just going on to the topic of this webinar, which I kept it as broad as possible, Ben, but I think it's something that we both kind of share, which is, I would call it kind of the restorative justice dream that everybody is kind of selling or trying to promote, but at the same time, and I think just going on to the wake-up call that people like you and I, whether it's because of practice and challenges and research and limitations with research and evidence, we kind of try to wake up people from this dream and just say, yes, restorative justice is, but. And I just wanted to kind of start by asking you, in this over 3 decades of practice of restorative justice, whether in the community, in the place, so within the system, what would you say was your kind of the highest and the lowest point in doing or seeing restorative justice, just to give like a bit of a feel for people who actually never had about restorative justice, or they don't know how to contextualize it, just think about it.
Yeah, you'll know that I always played the practitioner to your theorist, and I like to refer to cases. I can't do that and broadcast it because there's confidentiality, and that must remain. But I will talk about things as I can. Let's start at the lowest point. The lowest point was about 10 years ago, when somebody from a civil servant said that the government was only going to recognise scripted conferences as restorative justice, and everything else would be ignored and not afforded in any way. And what I'd found out was that flexibility was a thing, and that what victims wanted and needed in order to take part was some degree of certainty that their needs would be met. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole program back by 10 years. So that was my first low point. And I said to her at the time, I said, you've just put the whole... But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back. But I was wrong, because she'd in fact put it back by 20 years. And since then, we've had nothing but lots of arguments about people saying the right way, the right process, and it's come down to an argument about process and people trying to sell their particular type of training and having primacy within the system, when in fact it's wide enough for all kinds of ideas to be safely used. And you've been amongst one of those with your work in Rotherhithe, for which I thank you. This is about results that we can get, not process. It's not arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. And so that was one of my lowest points, arguments over process. The highest point, I would suggest is I have seen numerous people, and unfortunately most of them in this case were women, who were victims of the most serious crimes. Numerous people, and unfortunately most of them in this case were women, who were victims of the most serious crimes. Numerous people, and unfortunately most of them in this case were women, who were victims of the most serious crimes. Numerous people, and unfortunately most of them in this case were women, who were victims of the most serious crimes. Numerous people, and unfortunately most of them in this case were assaults, the like of rape and imprisonment, false imprisonment, and they've been empowered by restorative intervention to the extent that they took on the system that wasn't going to back them up and make prosecutions, and they've ended up with successful prosecutions and safety and settlement to the extent that they took on the system that wasn't going to back them up and make prosecutions, and they've ended up with successful prosecutions and safety and settlement to the extent that they took on the system that wasn't going to back them up and make prosecutions, and they've ended up with successful prosecutions and safety and settlement to the extent that they took on the system that wasn't going to back them up and make prosecutions, and they've ended up with successful prosecutions and safety and settlement to the extent that they took on the system that wasn't going to back them up and make prosecutions, and they've ended up with successful prosecutions and safety and settlement, yeah, and they've come up with a kind of a more peaceful life. You can't recover from that kind of thing. And I've also seen at the other end of the scale, I've seen young groups of men who were damned for being gang members coming together, coming to a true, I would call it settlement, I suppose is the word, an agreement. And you can, as you know, you can sense it when it's right. Yeah, there is something absolutely kind of visceral about a good settlement, and everyone went away not happy but content to carry on with life. So yeah, those are the things which have brought me the most pleasure, and I think there is, yeah, and they've come up with a kind of a future. There is a future for us yet. Yeah.
Just going to take it from the last kind of more positive note that your stories have, which is, I would ask you, and I think this is very important to kind of remind people that restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue the resolution or the outcome. The process itself is restorative justice is not criminal justice. It doesn't always pursue. Very powerful, and you mentioned the word empowerment, and especially with domestic violence and gender-based violence cases where the empowerment is such an important element of the process, and that sometimes that's all you need or all you get. Yeah. But I would ask you, what do you think you would say, in your view, is the biggest offer or the biggest advantage of restorative justice?
It's been thrust upon us somewhat. It will always be there as a theme and a development of justice generally, I hope. Yeah, but the failure of the justice system and I'm talking about just about the UK for the moment, and I know you have broader horizons, but we have come to see people who've come to restorative justice and don't want to be involved in the criminal justice system, the formal one. They don't want to be messed about by police. They don't want things to be broadcast. They want to find some settlement and a result for some serious stuff. Yeah. For example, we did a job on some problems that were going wrong within a sports network with coaches, but the person concerned did not want to do that formally. And similarly with some stalking, they did not want the police to take this up. And I come from a school of policing which was, shall we say, robust. And I'm very happy to take a hard line if that's what the system needs. But they didn't want that. And we've seen some very serious cases, especially when we were doing our watching brief on the Restore London work. We've seen enough cases to see there's a change coming, where people are avoiding the formal system, and that's because, apart from anything else, we had a victims law which went through, and which was worthless because it gave an exemption to everybody from any blame or responsibility whatsoever. So it's more about controlling victims than anything else. So as that kind of thing happens within government, within formal government, more and more people will look outside to things, well, hopefully for restorative justice, to get the kind of end that they want. I'm not saying I'm not against it, but we are a very useful adjunct to the system. Does that, I don't know, is that our greatest strength? I don't want to get into philosophy here, because I know you major in that, and I'm not going to take on an Aristotelian in debate, but there is a very firm philosophy in what we do as well, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that, there is this theoretical, the philosophical, or the value-based, I think, framework. Well, at least for me, and I know for you as well, is one of the strengths, because frankly, I can, and me as a previously criminal law lawyer, trying to still find it in the criminal justice system. What is the ethical framework? So yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that one. The opposite of that one, Ben, now is what would you say is your biggest concern for restorative justice, or for the development of restorative justice?
You may not like this. I don't think there is a profession for independent restorative practitioners, and they're dying out. I think that people still think about going from one organization to another. I've seen things where, for example, I've watched agencies, funding agencies, which means different forms of government, handing out small parcels to keep a system, an organization running, and then at the end of a year or two, may not like this. I don't think there is a profession for independent restorative practitioners, and they're dying out, dropping them out and going to somebody else. And that means that when they do that, they are starving all the rest of the restorative network of any funds whatsoever. And eventually there'll be nobody left. And you'll find when you start looking, there's no one there. Most of this work is done by amateurs. That's not to say they're not good practitioners, but you wouldn't set up a National Health Service and fund it by using first aiders. And there has to be some kind of progression. And I think we've been stripping it out until there's virtually nothing left. And that's the way I see it going on. And this is usually done by people who are put in post for a couple of years. They strip everything out and move on. Yeah. And that's really dangerous. And I'm sure you see that more than I do, actually, when you try to get funds. So that's my main concern. The other thing is we still have this dreadful argument about who has primacy and which agency is the right one, and should it be only meetings, and we say, oh, it's got to be this kind of process. I have majored in saying that there's as much to be gained from informal processes as staged conferences, and I shouldn't have to be doing that. We should all be welcoming each other as viable practitioners, so long as we're doing it safely and we're getting good results for the people concerned.
Yeah. I mean, I feel quite strongly about both of those concerns that you expressed, and I've expressed my own views publicly as well. What I have struggled to reconcile is, restorative justice is all about empowering the parties and allowing them to make a decision. And here we are as a movement imposing our own models and decisions on the parties. It's like the power abuse of the power abuse. And I find that quite uncomfortable when, the victim or the offender or the harmed and the harming party, if you like the right language, are saying, look, I'm not comfortable with this model. I want this model. And we're like, no, you need to have this model. For me, it's a replication of what we already got, which is you've got to do what you are told to do. And that just doesn't sit with me very, very well. But as you said, there are broader interests and power interest battles, as I call them in one of my papers, within our own movement. And until we sort that out, I don't think, for me at least, this concern is quite fundamental. So yeah, I would agree with you 100%. So yeah, I mean, just now moving on to kind of a bit more about the future generation, especially of, there's a lot of young people getting interested in restorative justice. There is a lot of courses now. People are doing PhDs. You even now have a master's in restorative justice in some universities. So yeah, lots of courses are teaching restorative justice. Lots of young people want to become practitioners. As we pass on the torch to the new generation, what would be your main message?
Okay, I'll give you an example. I took some documents about restorative justice, about different forms of work, about practice work. Yeah. How are you going to do the work? And I made them into documents, and then I did a word search, and I did a word cloud, yeah, to see what the words were important to the organizations concerned. And what I was looking for was to see what size the word victim would be on my cloud bump. It was almost infinitesimally small. And if anything had come out of my process, it had been that the victim is virtually ignored. I had a word with police where the first assessment should be done, and the best I got from was, well, we give them a leaflet, and that's with everything on it. Yeah. There is virtually no assessment of their needs done. We were promised there would be. Yeah. And it goes all the way through the system. We were promised this was going to happen. We were promised in meeting after meeting with government, and it has never happened. And that's where I belong. Okay. And what I would suggest to them is that you need to get everything signed off by all parties. I'm not saying one side or the other. And when you do these assessments, find out what you can offer, let them know, and then when you come to some conclusion, write it down briefly. It doesn't have to be great work, and get them to agree to it, to sign it. No, not necessarily, it has to be physical, does it? But it needs to be signed off. And then you have some basis, both to know what you've achieved for them, and also to know from your perspective something to work on as to whether the work that's been delivered was effective at all. Yeah, it's for research. And then when you come to some conclusion, write it down briefly. It doesn't have to be great work, and get them to agree to it, to sign it. No, not necessarily, it has to be physical, does it? But it needs to be signed off. And then you have some basis, both to know what you've achieved for them, and also to know from your perspective something to work on as to whether it's the only way. Because what's happened with research in the past is that when you come for a researcher, you choose what you want to find, you then choose the researcher that's going to find it for you. You want it guaranteed. That's what's happened in the past. And if you say to somebody, I'm going to offer you this as a process on top of the criminal law, and you give them lots of support, then you're going to get a false positive. Yeah, there's a kind of a, what's the word? It's a bias. There's a bias towards success. Yeah, that's built into that system, and a confirmation bias is what I'm searching for. And we've gone along so far. Everything's been on confirmation bias. Well, get the hard evidence. Prove to us. You and I saw, didn't we, when we looked from above, that a lot of this work is not victim focused. It's not. Yeah, it's not what people say. People will write down what they think you want to hear. We need to prove to people that it works, and we've got to do that in our practice from the very start. So that's what I would say to them. If you can do that, yeah, if you can be rigorous with your work, you're going to succeed. Because if you wouldn't have come into our I call it the business, you wouldn't have come into our field of work if you weren't motivated anyway. That's a given.
Yeah, no, that's such an important point. And I tried to, because one of my concerns was about consistency and good quality of practice that is, aligned with the restorative justice values. And we recently published the restorative justice practice framework. Absolutely. Well, and thank you for contributing to that, because, one of the things that I think you and I kept saying that, if it's victim led, if you approach the victim first, if you have the interest and the buy-in, then half of the job is done, Absolutely. Well, and thank you for contributing to that, because, one of the things that I think you and I kept saying that, if it's victim led, if you approach the victim first, if you have the interest, you're not going to go to the offender and, let them down, because then you're going to go to the victim and say that, the victim is not ready, and the offender is already in the system. They're not going to go anywhere. They're already in the system, and I think that's what people don't realize, that you've got to have both parties on board. And the other concern that I've also shared with you in the past is that both parties can withdraw anytime. It doesn't mean because you started the process that you have to. This is not a court. This is not something that you impose on people.
There's another brief point that I've learned through the process, which I don't think we have discussed, and that is there's another group of victims who are desperately affected by the criminal process, and that is the families of incarcerated prisoners. The suffering that comes to those families, both mental and physical and financial, is enormous, and maybe there's work to be done there in bringing them into the system. Yeah. Which again shows there's hope for expansion in the future. I do hope so anyway.
Yeah, I mean the practice and the theory continue to develop. I think every year I continue to learn. As you know, now I'm involved in a national pilot where we're trying to create the first best practice model for the youth justice services. This is something we've never done before. So yeah, well, let's hope that we'll try and be consistent. And yeah, well, thank you again for all the work that you've done and the support that you have given us.
I just wish you all well, you and your team. Yeah. Good luck.
Thank you, Ben. No, and thank you for all the multi-year support in so many different ways. Thank you.